So I'll start with that screw on the base of the camera that didn't want to move. And that's right here. I haven't even tried this yet, but I can be pretty sure it's not going to want to move. A couple of taps with the hammer. Can you see any of this? There's this screw here that holds those struts in place. I'm applying some torque with finger and thumb. That was all that was required. A couple of sharp taps with the hammer and that screw came loose. So now I've got to do the same for the two screws here in the film cassette well, which will have to be done off camera because I've run out of places to hold this. It has to be held between my knees. One. Two. I think that's it. Let's check that's moving. That one's not. Okay. Now it is. Right. Hammer time is over. Get these screws out. All four screws taken out now, I think, is it? Is the one still in the base? No, we've got that too. Okay, so there's our struts coming out. Pop them to one side. Here's the transfer shaft that takes the cocking action from the cocking rack at the back of the camera to the shutter at the front. There's the bracket that holds that little shaft in place. And there's the return spring for the shutter release mechanism. And the body is pretty much ready to go. That spacer there came off the shutter release. I suggested that there wasn't one present, but obviously there was. And this spacer washer here goes between the frame at the base of the camera here and that little bracket that holds that shaft goes at the top in the same position. So the body I can put to one side for cleaning. And go over here out of harm's way. These pieces need to go off to the ultrasonic cleaner. Everything else gets cleaned by hand. And the struts, I'm interested in looking at the state of these because I know they're not right. Yeah, the inner strut here on this side, this is the top. You can see that strut is very bent. The strut at the bottom here, that's even worse. So they need to be squared up. The inner strut should be completely straight. The posts at the ends should be obviously at 90 degrees to those struts. The top, both of those are quite badly bent. The outer struts at this point here, these cross arms are the outer ones, they should be slightly dished. They should be in slightly at the hinge point in the middle, out slightly at the ends, and what that does is when this is in the camera body, it applies tension on here which acts to push these pins firmly into position where they're supposed to latch in. At the moment they don't want to know about that because everything else is too bent. So bending time. Alright, well I'll start with this one here, and I'll grab that pin at the end and square that up. I'm getting the jaw here further down that shaft there where I can see the bend starting. I'll check if I've made any good progress there. Yeah, I have, but there's still quite a bend in that. That looks good. And its mate on the other side here, it's probably not as bad. Oh, it's all right at the end by the looks of it. I just felt something crack. That strut broke there. Where it was bent, it was right on that edge. I think these are going to have to be replaced. I don't know whether I can solder that successfully. There's almost no metal there, that's why it broke right at that point. Oh, I think that's what happened. I'll have to have a closer look at that. I'm not sure whether that cracked. It might just have been the pliers slipping on that tab. Yeah, there's a step in that arm. It's a joggle. That's what I'm seeing. I thought that it had cracked, but it wasn't. That's just the joggle. Okay. Those inner arms appear straight, as they should. The outer arms, I'm just checking to see if they've got the appropriate curve on them. That's a little bit more. And with this parallel, how springy is that? We got there 55, 55. So that's about parallel. I'm just checking how much spring I've got on these buttons. That feels appropriate. I think that'll do. There doesn't appear to be any rattle in those struts. I think we've got away with that one. I mean, normally you do. It's very unusual to have anything break on you because the metal is either brass or steel, but both of them are fairly malleable metals. They'll take a bit of bending before they go. Alright, I think that was successful. I can clean those up and put them back in the body, but the greasiest piece I've got to deal with here is the focus mount. Now that grease looks pretty dry to me. I'll start by cleaning this with some naphtha and a cotton bud and see if it wipes off. Well, it does. Often the grease is hardened beyond the point where naphtha makes much of an impression on it, and it has to be scraped off. We'll have to use more aggressive solvents. So the grease hasn't hardened up completely yet. I'll just use a toothpick to run around behind those two guide posts for the inner helical. And it'll get down into the crevices at the bottom, into the corner. Well, the camera's done virtually no work. Very likely it's had virtually no servicing either. Though we'll know more when I come to the shutter, because shutters never were expected to go decades without servicing. That looks good. Pop that to one side, and I'll deal with these struts, which aren't going to need much cleaning. I'll just fold this paper over to get that nasty thick grease tucked away where I can't see it, because otherwise I'll inevitably end up with a big lump of it on my hand and then be transferring it to everything. Now those lines on the front there would have been where the focus scale ring was contacting that front plate, and it would have been contacting that front plate because the screws were loose that held the focus mount to the front standard. All of this is unusually clean. Usually they're well covered with dust and grime, and sometimes corrosion. Now I'm looking at the slots top and bottom here, where the door hooks into this. There's a few marks on this one in particular. Now those scuff marks are quite likely been caused by the door rubbing on those for two reasons: because the paper shim washers are missing, and because everything was out of alignment because the struts were bent. That's not a serious issue, of course. Those little marks in the chrome will be neither here nor there, largely invisible, and they won't affect anything. I'm just cleaning the slots where the rivets run. I'll just that all looks very good. I'll run a bit of molybdenum paste over that area to get that. Make sure that runs smoothly. That's good. That's like the bought one. Here's the focus scale ring, and you can see by the colour of the grease on that's still quite good and unused. Grease is normally much closer to black, and it's much closer to black because it's typically full of dust particles and probably metal particles too that have gathered up over time. But that grease looks the colour or close to it of fresh grease, which means that it hasn't gathered up dust and dirt. And the knob here, the focus setting knob here on the wheel, typically those serrations are typically full of skin cells and grease and all the other rubbish that they can get, and that looks quite clean. If you fail to mark your focus scale ring and your helical so you know exactly where things are to go back, you can often get it pretty accurately just by looking for marks where the screws have bitten in to the focus scale ring in 4 places here. And in this case there are clear indentations, and there aren't multiples, there are just the 4. So that would be an indication of where the focus had been set correctly in the past. And very likely now that the struts are straightened up, that the focus will be correct at that point again. The way the camera had been when it arrived here, the front standard would effectively have been floating somewhere back from where it should have been, and so particularly at the close end of the focus scale, stuff would not have been good. Closer items certainly wouldn't be in focus. Alright, those parts all look quite good, so I will get my other mechanical parts out of the ultrasonic cleaner. They just about should be done. When I've got them clean, I'll start reassembling the body, and when the body's reassembled, I'll work on the shutter and rangefinder. Well, what I'm mostly interested in, of course, is the state of the struts and how well they're going to behave. So I normally start by putting the struts back in fairly early in the piece anyway. I've got my parts back from the cleaning, so I'll gather together the pieces I need here to put the struts in place. And one of the spacers is doing its best to evade me at the moment. There it is. Okay. Four black screws. The 2 prettiest ones to go into the film chamber. The ugliest one to be hidden under the leatherette. And the struts themselves, of course. And the return spring for the shutter release. Right, we'll start with the shaft. The cocking shaft that takes the action from the cocking rack towards the front of the camera. So I'm putting some synthetic grease on that, putting that down in there. It's sometimes tucks right underneath the last pleat of the bellows, so you sometimes have to swing that into place a bit. Here's the little bracket that holds that in place. I'm positioning that in against the shaft here and against the top of the camera. I'll rub a bit of molybdenum paste on this shaft here for the shutter release. Doesn't need much, just a tiny smear, and put the spring in place. Here I've got the struts. Now normally I lubricate the slots at the back of the struts at this stage. I don't do the ones at the front of the struts because I'll only end up removing all that grease on my fingers while I'm getting everything in place. The shutter release part here, normally I just run a little bit of molybdenum paste in between the spring there, some at the top for good measure, and typically once through that piece there. Now, getting this correctly positioned like that, that's the way it goes in. Short end here downwards, this piece facing to the front. Now I've got to swing it into place in the body without disturbing that bracket that holds that shaft in place. So first thing I've got to do is get this over the shaft here. Like that. And then swing these struts down into place without disturbing that bracket. No, that was a dismal failure. The bracket's moved. Okay, so see if I can put that bracket back in place. Try this again. That time it worked. So the bracket's in position. I've got to get the screw through the top there. So I'm just checking these screws, see which is the prettiest ones. That's not a pretty one. That is. There it is. This one here can go in here. That screw passes through the bracket and into the struts mechanism. At the base of the camera, this washer, this spacer washer, goes in the same relative position. So I'll slide that down the camera like that, lift the struts back with the tip of my tweezers to allow that washer to drop down into position, which it's not doing. Start again. Yes, that just dropped into place. I can just see it through the hole here. I'll hook it into position. And the ugliest of the 4 screws can go in that position. You can usually tell it's usually got paint or adhesive or scraps of leather or something on it. That's good. So I've got those 2 screws lightly in place. In the film cassette chamber here, got to line up those holes and get the screws in there. as usual, you get all your screws in position and then you tighten things up. If you get enthusiastic and put a screw in and just tighten it up, you'll inevitably find that you can't manoeuvre the other pieces to where you want them to be. Right, so I'll do the screws up now. And that's my strut sitting in position. No, it's not. Look what's happened. While I was busy getting everything in place, the shutter release had come off the shaft, so I've got to do that over again. What happens when you're too busy talking instead of working? I must have lifted that shutter release off the shaft completely while I was wriggling the struts into position the second time. Alright, back where we were. Where's that washer? I want that washer. It's hiding somewhere. Here it is. Right. That bracket back in position. Struts fully extended. Get this on the shutter release shaft. Get the struts down into position. Make sure that the arm is where I left it. It appears to be. Make sure I'm clear which screws are going where. Start with this one. Get my washer. Slide that down in there, lift that with the tip of the tweezers, have a look underneath, see where the washer is. Yes, that looks good. Two screws in the film cassette chamber. All screws present and correct. I can now tighten them up. And what have I got? That looks better. That pops out, the buttons pop into place. And I'm checking to see how square this is with the body now, see if it's improved any. Yes. It's about 17 millimeters, and that's nice and even. So that's a good result. That means that the front standard is now square to the body and it's probably at the correct distance. Previously I was getting 17 millimeters or thereabouts at this end and 15 right at that end, particularly at the bottom. Now I want to get the focus mount back into that body. Of course I've got that nice and clean now. and I'll need the 4 screws that hold that in position. I could have sworn that video camera was telling me that the battery was nearly flat, but it's not saying that now, so perhaps I imagined the whole thing. These 4 screws, of course, were loose when I took the camera apart. And we'll certainly make sure that they're not loose this time round. Where's the last one hiding? Oh, there it is. So making sure these 2 arms here are flipped back out of the way. They're the 2 lock arms that make sure that you don't fold the front of the camera up without returning the focus to infinity. At least that's the idea. Of course, like most preventative measures like that, it assumes that no one's going to be applying excessive force. So I'm just doing these screws up very lightly at this stage, just getting them in place. That's good, they're all sitting in place. I'll just collapse that front standard and do up the 4 screws, get them snug. Now while I've got it there, I'll put my 4 screws in place that hold the bellows to the back of the front standard. Now one of these screws was somewhat chewed up looking, so we'll find a replacement for the chewed up looking one. It's this one. It looks like somebody's run a drill bit down the centre. The video camera has now decided that its battery is tired and it does want to have a little rest, so while I'm busy finding a 4th screw, I'll change the battery.